Okay, so does everybody see that? Get that? Okay. So as mentioned, this is part 2 of our presentation. So yesterday, just to briefly review some of the things we talked about. In our system, we talked about the aspect of a fixed coop that is in the poultry production unit is shared with a rotational fenced paddock so that the birds are allowed always to free range outside. That paddock is managed in a particular way with an overhead canopy created by perennials and also some larger trees, with a lot of effort to keep ground cover and new fresh sprouts on the ground for the birds. For the feed, besides the concentrated non-GMO feed, we also supplement that with sprouts and soaked grains. Focus heavily on humane treatment of the birds, both in terms of space and in terms of their handling, to provide them with less stress in their lives, a natural life, which also has impacts upon the taste of the bird in the end. And for the system, we use a slow growth, good ranging breed. The one we use is called the Freedom Ranger. The purpose of that being you need a breed that will actually be able to benefit from the paddock, will have behaviors where they do like to walk, they do like to scratch and explore, as opposed to the Cornish broilers that will just pretty much sit once they exit the coop. So the efforts with the paddock really don't come into play. So those are the basics, just to review those quickly. But today we want to talk about some of these other issues. So starting with a little bit more about the water system and feed system, and then going into the raising of the flock. Water is extremely important to the birds for their digestion. It's often said that birds can go for a few days without food, but you get beyond a day with water and they begin to have trouble. And those stresses upon the system of the bird really never really recuperate from that if they're too stressed, especially, for example, if it's hot weather, not enough water, that will create issues in terms of their long-term growth as well. So the important thing is to maintain a supply always of clean, available water. And that can be done in multiple ways. What we've often used is, like here we brought out a water line to the coop. So I have a hydrant. From that we connect hoses that go to watering stands, both inside and outside the coop, and make use of bell drinkers that operate on a spring system. So that there's always fresh water available to the chickens. As they drink from the tray, it reduces the weight. With the spring, it raises up, opens a valve, and again refills with water. So that works very well. There's always the option of manual drinkers where you're constantly filling 3-gallon, 5-gallon drinkers, setting them around. There's a lot of flexibility to that, but it's also a lot more work each day. This automatic system works well. Inside, we've done the same type of water with the coop we're currently using. If you have a different kind of coop with rafters or a ceiling or something solid to screw into, you're able to suspend the waters from that, and your water tubing, your PVC pipe or whatever you use, can also be hung easily. With the hoop coop, it's a little bit harder because of the height of that, and also you don't want to put a lot of weight on those hoop structures. So we've just built these internal sawhorses and used those as the supports. One important aspect about the water line is that it does need to be relatively low pressure for these drinkers to work. Too much pressure and they will leak more often, or spring leaks where the tubing is pushed off of the drinker itself. So that can be done by a simple pressure reducer that reduces the pressure in the line, or by the use of a tank that's filled on a tower, and just that gravity pressure works well as well. Just some of the options about drinkers. There are these bell drinkers that I talked about, the type that we used in the past, and since we have them, we continue to. But there's a lot of talk among poultry producers for the use of what are called nipple drinkers. They can be attached to simple PVC pipe, perhaps supported by another pipe above that to keep them level, which is important for their function. They can be placed about every 6 to 12 inches. So depending on the number of birds that you have in your flock. But here it's the birds simply activated by moving the little lever. It keeps the water clean inside. There's some that do have a drip cup as well to reduce any dripping that might happen. But an important aspect is just to maintain and manage the pressure. For the small birds, that pressure is lower. You don't need a lot of water to flow when they touch it. For the bigger birds, that pressure is increased. And you also change the height of your pipe as the birds grow so that they're always stretching a little bit to reach it. So those are two options that can be used in terms of setting up a water system for the poultry. The feed system, important aspect is storage. Whether you use a grain bin or, as our case, we've used gravity wagons. On this, it holds 250 bushels, about 10,000 pounds at a crack, which for a flock this size is a fairly good amount. You don't want it to get more than a month old because of issues of mold or just it loses some of its flavor over time. So it's good to have relatively fresh feed for the birds. So you don't want to load up too much if you're not going to be using it immediately. To feed that, we do, as this aspect of the feed, we do provide it in these basic canister feeders. Again, we use sawhorses to support those when they're suspended. There's movement as the birds knock them around and the grain is able to settle down. If they're placed directly on the ground, it's a little harder for that feed to kind of continue to fall into the tray. So suspension is important to find some way that you're able to do that. As far as the quantity, with the concentrated feed, we start with what's called starter, chick starter, which is a little higher protein, about 20%. And we'll feed about 3 pounds per bird of that. It lasts about the first 25, 28 days. After that, they're shifted to developer or grower. And with that, they'll use about 10 to 12 pounds during those following weeks up through week 10. So we do put out the feed every day in the morning. You start out, you're feeding them maybe 50 pounds of feed. By the end, you're 450 pounds. So you just keep increasing that as you notice whether the birds are consuming it all during the day or if they're leaving it. But there's a kind of a schedule in which you can increase that. You don't want to overfeed them initially because if they grow in weight too fast, they begin to have problems with their legs. So there's a bit of rationing done, but you do want to also make sure that there's enough that they can continue steady growth. Beyond that, we also use a soaked grain mix that we'll talk about. About 2 to 3 pounds per bird figured in what is used for that. And then there's other grains that are simply sprouted out here in the paddock to maintain good sprouting and forage for them to feed off of as well. And in the day, we tend to put the feed out early in the morning, And again, if you can, late afternoon, that seems to be the times when the birds do all go out to eat. But even to place enough of it in the morning, it'll still be there in the afternoon if you don't have a schedule that allows you to be present multiple times during the day. So those are just kind of some initial things about setting up those systems. And then we'll talk about what we do once we have a coop. I do want to just make sure that we've got everybody on here that's somebody's not waiting to be added. I guess we're doing okay. So we'll go back to this. So the brooding is the period of the first about 4 weeks in the life of the bird. The very important thing to maintain there is that sufficient heat. The birds do need the possibility to at least be warmed around 85 degrees. You don't necessarily have to keep your entire coop at that level, but you do have to have some heat lamps or infrared heaters, whether those be electric or propane, but something that provides at least an area where they can go to become warmed, but enough of it that actually you're covering a good area of it, and we'll explain why that's important later. But the important thing in setting up your brooder is you set up a brooder guard. Its intention is to keep them a little more focused on the area that you're managing with the heaters and the feed, the water. It also prevents some drafts that are kind of dangerous for them at a small age. So it's important to keep them well protected at the beginning. You put down some bedding, whether that's pine shavings initially for the chicks, or later on there's things like wood chips or straw that can be used. Each one has kind of its different pros and cons. So you have your water, your heat, we'll bring in the feed, you have their bedding, so you're really ready to go. Well, the chicks, when they arrive, they either arrive by the post office about 2 to 3 days after they've been sent from the hatchery, depending on the distance. Or they can also be delivered at times, if you're close to the route, by truck. We've lately been able to get them by truck. They do come often the afternoon following when they're hatched. So that's, the sooner you can get them, the better. To shorten the stress of that journey for them, and also to get them back to food and water as quickly as possible. So here we have a group that's preparing that space, making sure the waters are working, the heat lamps work, the feeders are set out. The chick feeders are these small, low, narrow feeders that we use initially, and then switch to the bigger canisters once they've started to eat more and grown a little bit. So this is, as you see, everybody's wearing winter coats. It's not real warm in there generally, but with the heat lamps on, with some sunlight, it is able to get warmed up. These are insulated walls and ceiling. So if necessary, we can also add additional propane heat and get this warmed up. For us, that's an issue if we start early spring with the birds. And this shows to another coop where the birds are now out and active and spread out well. And so you can see that they're only a couple days old, but already very active and eating and ready to go. Just to mention a couple things about that preparation also is that between every flock, to clean and disinfect the coop, wash things, the equipment in the coop with bleach, set up that brooder guard, make sure everything's working. And we'll talk a little bit here about GroGel and starter feed, but make sure that that's already on hand a few days before your chicks arrive. And make sure you have sufficient chick feeders. The important thing is that they have access to, easy access to food and water. Otherwise, if they do not find that immediately, there can be some issues see here. See someone else is joining us. Try to make sure we got somebody back there that wants to get in and make sure we can get to that. Okay, so yeah, so the chick feeders, if they don't get that immediately, there can be starve out. So we want to make sure that that does happen. So here's an example of those feeders that we were talking about. I'm going to get rid of this pointer so I can get that in. Okay. So the heat lamps are these simple ones, with the 125 or 250 watt bulb, heat lamp bulb, or a propane heater that we've gotten. These are infrared. The important thing is to measure a little bit the temperature underneath the lamps to be able to gauge how high you should raise them above the floor, because you do want it to be providing some heat, but not too much so that the chickens under there can get overstressed by the heat as well. These need to be placed about 3 to 4 feet above the ground, just that they do not overheat as well. And having sufficient number of those is important. Here's a little video that shows that first day. You can see how the chicks are. This is day 1. You notice they're very active and finding that food, finding the heat, finding the water. Oops. Also, the GroGel I mentioned, this is a probiotic. This comes as a powder. You just mix it with a small amount of water, and it becomes in this gel state. We just place that on trays, feed it to the chicks as initial food after their journey. It gives them some extra energy and a good start to their digestive system. We started using this a couple years ago and found that we believe it's beneficial. It actually is packed by the hatchery when they ship the chickens as well. And talking about the heat, it's important as you do an observation of your flock to just notice some different things about how they spread around that brooder guard. The ideal spread is that they're pretty much evenly spread out everywhere. That shows that the heat that it's warm enough. They're not drawn specifically to the heat. And they're free to roam and to eat and to find the water. And kind of what you're looking for is that freedom of movement for the birds. If it's too warm under the lamp, they'll stay away from it. So here it would just be a question of raising the lamp higher so that it's not overheating that particular area. If they do actually group, if it's kind of cool and they do flock underneath that lamp and to get warm, if it's too warm, the ones in the center might get stuck in the crowd and that might overheat. So we have lost a few chicks that way, that it just gets too warm for them. If things are too cold, they will flock primarily just under those lamps, which will restrict their freedom to move, to eat, to drink the water. So here's a question of you need to do something to warm up your coop better than that. If there's a draft, they'll move to the other side. You may need to find out if there's some hole or somewhere where that cold breeze is coming in and figure out a way to block that. Those are just some things to observe as you're working with your chicks. Here shows them in our new larger coop, about a week old. This time we've taken the brooder guards off to give them more space to start to move around. We've also added some other feeder trays with a little more feed and some of the canisters. They're starting to eat more. These do come with a little bar that rotates up above the tray so the chickens don't stand in it and poop. We find that it's a little hard to fill the trays with those in, so it's kind of an option. We've actually taken them away from most of them, but there can be an advantage to just keeping the feed cleaner by the use of those. It's the same issue with these. It's partly providing sufficient feed, but also with them standing inside, it's not always the best hygiene. So some of those are kind of practical decisions about how many feeders you have and how much pressure there is at the moment. That's why getting the top back on is good. That way they just have to eat around the edges and they aren't standing in it as well. Again, here you see the waters. We just have a PVC pipe that's extended. The water line goes along this wall. We've got some PVC pipes that are drawn out across the building. And from those there's valves that attach these smaller 1/4-inch tubing to be able to supply the water to the waters. Again, with the bedding, it's just important to keep it renewed and dry. If there is a spill or some of this does get wet, it's important to just scoop that part away and put some fresh, dry bedding down. So while they're spending that time inside, you want to make sure you prepare your outside paddock. And here we did establish a series of those feeders. For a flock of 1,500, we use about 35 feeders. You can do 3 on a stand. These are just 8-foot 2x4s. About, I guess we got it, let's see. Yeah, I think 3 feet legs. So it's just enough that you need to suspend your feeders. It works pretty well to give them that option. As you see, this paddock is, as we talked about yesterday, is still in development. There are some hazelnuts growing, and it has a pasture mix underneath, but there's also areas where, as you see, plenty of weeds that grow as well. But the chickens will eat down a good amount of that. There's a lot of clover here that they also like. And the way we fill these, we bring it out take it from the gravity wagon, fill a wheelbarrow. We can put about 150 pounds in these. At the end, we're using 3 of them, so 450 pounds of feed. And we just start out first with maybe 2 scoops per canister and can increase that up to 4. But it's just, the important thing is to provide multiple places where they can eat so that as many birds as possible can get to the food. If not, it's the big ones that will get around first and not allow the small ones to eat. They have to wait their turn. But as there's not sufficient places to eat, eventually there will be a lot of inequality in the terms of the weight of the birds. Some will get a lot heavier and others will remain kind of small. So the more you can level that out, the better for your production. Again, here just shows the construction, very simple, kind of a 2x4 top and bottom as well. Build your stand and a PVC pipe that you can connect to the hose. This gives you the possibility to disconnect and move them around. And a lot of freedom connecting these just by hoses. You can go you put them where you need to as you're moving their birds back farther in the paddock. So when they first come out, again, about the end of week 4, it's time to open the doors of the coop. At first, the chickens will just venture out slightly, a little bit nervous, a little scared, but they're interested. So initially, you set some of the feeders a little closer to the coop to draw them out. But once they're out, then you start using the feeder stands. As they start to chew down, some of this area, you want to keep moving those back further and further so that they're using the entire paddock and not overgrazing a particular area. Again, you put that feed out in the morning and have your waters available as well, close to it. And that's pretty much how they spend their day. As mentioned, it's something you do early morning. You go around 6:30, close to sunrise or dawn. Important thing is that as you get there early, then the birds are not already all hungry and waiting to come out. So if you can get those doors open, first get the feed out before you open the doors, or else you're working around a lot of chickens. The important thing is just every morning, early morning, to get out there and do the feeding. This is your primary chore during the day. You get the feed out, you check the waters, make sure things are clean, make sure everything's operating properly. Once the chickens are out of the coop, you can check internally if there's any issues. But a lot of observation about just how the flock is doing. Watch them as they come out. And notice if there's any that are having difficulty walking or seem to have health issues. But doing that, it does get you out in a very nice, you get to enjoy nature a lot by getting up early like that. Another aspect is record keeping. It's important to have some data to know how to manage your flock and see how things are going. So to do that every day, you write down the amount of feed that you're feeding, both in terms of the dry concentrated feed and the soaked grains. You check if there's any birds that have died, the temperature of the coop, the condition of the bedding, and the amount used, the time you're spending. All those things help you to manage just your efficiency and your supplies, and also to know whether the conditions need some kind of management or adjustment so that it's more healthy for the birds. Also, once a week, you take a record of the bird weights. You can do that by simply placing it. At first, you can get a number of them in a 5-gallon bucket and just use a fish scale or something to weigh that. Make sure you get the tear weight. But then as they get bigger, you can only get one in that bucket. They're a little bit hard to catch, and you just want to make sure you don't injure them in the process. That's not, kind of defeats the purpose. But you do want to get 10 birds or so, perhaps differing weights, so it gives you some sense of average. And you can begin to notice whether they're growing appropriately. After a while, you get to know kind of the benchmarks for that growth over those weeks. So if they're getting behind, you maybe increase the feed a little bit. But just gives you a chance to begin to track how your birds are doing. Also, you want to do a perimeter check relatively frequently, just making sure that there's no signs of predators or access points in your fence to keep that as safe of an area as possible. The bigger problem is the overhead predators, often the hawks or eagles, where until those trees get grown, you can have a lot of open access, and there's not a lot that can be done, but there is some reflective tape that can be at times stretched over sections of that. And as that moves in the wind, the birds get a little disoriented and may not be as anxious to land. But again, that's where the purpose of the trees and the canopy, though it takes some time to develop, will help to resolve that issue. And in the meantime, as said, the planting of corn or sunflowers can help to provide some of that same protection while those hazelnuts or other perennials develop. It's also important to spend some attention just observing your chickens, observing the environment, paying attention. If there's a presence of a smell of ammonia, it's perhaps that there's too much humidity or perhaps too many water leaks. And as that begins to build, that can cause respiratory problems, not only for the birds, but also for you. So it's important to have sufficient ventilation, ways to open those doors, those windows, or if you have electricity, use the use of fans to just keep some air moving and sucking that out of the building so that it can stay as fresh as possible. As mentioned, wet bedding, you want to remove that, pay attention to that air quality, and especially the issue of heat initially. Once they're feathered out, they're much more resistant. It's not an issue, but it's those initial couple of weeks where you really want to keep their stress down. It'll pay off in the long run for the health of your flock. Also note their behavior. If they're having difficulty walking, if they're becoming too aggressive toward each other, try to figure out what it is that might be lacking for them that's causing those issues. And if there are some sick birds you notice, it's good to isolate them. So there are a lot of chicken diseases that are quite contagious. Ours, we do vaccinate against Mareks disease, but we don't use any other antibiotics. But it is important that if you have some that do seem to be getting sick, to move them away from the other birds in a special area so that not all of them are exposed. So this one just shows how the birds like to come out once it is time. You got the feed already distributed to all of the feeders, and you open the doors, and here they come. They'll move out, as far as you put those feeders. You do it gradually. They'll learn to keep walking, but they'll go all the way out to where they can find those. Also, we talked yesterday a lot about the paddock, but here we want to demonstrate one of the effects of that as well. So here you have your hazelnut trees that are grown to provide some coverage around your paddock area. There are some weeds and sprouts that are growing on the ground, but you notice the chickens have very little stress, enjoying being out in the shade. They stay out, they scratch, they find bugs, sit down. I mean, it's a good life for a chicken. This is what we kind of strive for, providing for them. So it's not just the eating, but it's also they have some kind of a natural life that they can enjoy as well. And here we have the corn that's kind of planted in between to provide some additional shade. There's limited usefulness of it in terms of harvest. There's a lot of regulations regarding food safety about anything that's grown in a paddock with chickens. But for things that are higher above the chickens, where they're not so affected by the manure or things, there's still some, the sunflowers or once it did popcorn, grew very well. But those are up and a little less exposed. If you handle them properly, I think there's still some things you can do. But the main benefit in terms of growing other things is using the manure from the coops as fertilizer for other crops on your farm, other vegetables outside of the paddock itself. Another important thing is the use of apple cider vinegar. We find that this has been a good preventative and a good health treatment for a number of issues. One especially is what's called coccidiosis, that you note because of blood in the stool. Then the other chickens will peck at that, and they can also be infected. It has to do with a parasite that lives in the chicken gut. By using apple cider vinegar, it's able to change the pH of the gut that becomes less hospitable to that parasite, and the chickens easily can recover from it. We do some of that in a prevention manner with like a teaspoon per gallon that's added to their water. Or once we find some kind of a coccidiosis happening, then we increase that as a treatment, doubling the amount. But we usually get probably go through 10 gallons or so for a flock. We use some of it also in the soaking of the grains, but that's a good investment for as a health aspect of your flock. We talked also about soaking the grains. Here we used to use initially just barley, but we found that it's better to use a mix of grains that provides a better level of protein and nutrition mix. So now we use about 30% corn, 20% barley or wheat, some sorghum, oats, field peas, sunflower, and buckwheat. Buckwheat is expensive, but it's also highly nutritious, so we do add some of that in as well. We simply soak those in these bins for 3 days, so we kind of keep a rotation going. Put in about 2 pounds per bird, so it becomes a bushel and a half or so of dry grain. We just fill that part way in the bin, cover it up with water, and in the water we've mixed in some apple cider vinegar as well. There are other things that can be added, some onions and garlic and elderberry syrup that all have some health benefit. And so by able to add that to these seeds, it gets soaked in and becomes available to the chickens that way as well. And here's how we kind of feed that in these troughs. They're just made from PVC pipe, 4-inch pipe. That's the top about third is cut off. You cut them in half. They're a little too open and they spill a lot, but by leaving a little bit of more of the beyond a semicircle, then it closes in well. But here shows the chickens out in their paddock. And these are some of the portable waters that could be used. And also, we talked about the stages of the paddock. Here's where it has those fresh sprouts that the chickens are getting after. But after they've been out there a while, they will eat that down. We tend to cover that with straw. They're waiting to be rotated very soon to the other side. Here's some of those soaked grains. And here's comfrey, which is another plant that can be used because of its nutritional value. Very good anti-inflammatory, helps with their joints and their respiration. And it's something we're trying to increase as part of their diet and test the benefit of that. Another thing is checking chicken health regularly. Here, if you grab their wings, you can kind of test how much they'll fight. If they have some good resistance, it shows that they're healthy and strong. So other things where you can check the development of the breast meat, check their gizzards, see if they're if they're eating well, if this is full. You can check the feet to make sure there's no cuts or problems with that. Just generally, you can get a sense of the health of the bird by checking that periodically, to check a number of birds just to see how things are going. And here's a flock that's now in the coop about ready to go for processing. You see how they've filled up that space. There's still some open space back here. It's not totally full, but they do tend to flock together a little more closely. They'll also, as you see, find places to sit and perch wherever they can get. But this is right before they go out in the morning. Got some roosters trying to get started too.
The chickens, as they wake up in the morning, ready to go outside. So they're up and about, ready to wait for their food.
And then finally, get to the day where it's time to harvest. Again, with these slow growth breeds, they say 77 to 84 days. We found that for the size we want for our market, at about 70 to 77 days is a good time to try to find processing for us. To load them, we use turkey crates that are a little bit taller, gives them more space. We put about 10 or 11 birds in a crate. And to capture them, we try to do that kind of with as least stress as possible. It's important not to be real rough with the birds. They can get injured in the process, and also that stress releases some hormones that can affect even the taste of the meat. So kind of as quietly and gently as that can be done. So it's important to have enough people, because it is kind of a tiring task. But if you have enough people and find an efficient way of moving the crates around, we're able to do that pretty well. So that takes us from start to finish of what to do with some birds. We'll have some time now for questions. I see there's been some chat things that have come in. I haven't had a chance to check those. But here's also to note our website, where you can find some more information about our system, and also my email, bobkel@mainstreetproject.org. If you want to send any questions, or certainly open to any comments or ongoing discussion that you'd like to have. And we'll also, if you just request our chicken manual, we'll be able to send a digital copy of that to you. So this is always so get out of that screen. We'll go over to some of these questions here that people have asked. Then I'll spin this up as well. So once we get through these, also we'll maybe we'll try to go through these quickly, and then you can open up your mic if you have any other stuff. And I will be here also until 11:30 our time, another half hour, so we can keep talking if you'd like. So Sharon asks, what are we using as a parameter in the brooder? Suppose you're looking in terms of size. Let's see. We use basically a 60-foot piece of brooder guard. So it basically is about 10 by 20, something like that for the size of that area. You can adjust that. The important thing there is to try to avoid corners, because they will kind of, if they're cold, they will crush into those corners, and some of them do get injured. So rounding it is a good idea. Around the fencing around the paddock, we use a 5-foot fence. It's basically a predator fence. We've used woven wire. We've used kind of that 1-inch. It's more than chicken wire. It's more the welded wire. We've used different things. Right now we have one it's more of a nylon wire, but it's got some other wires, top wire that's stretched in between the posts, and then it's attached to those. So there's different things, but the important thing is just depending on what your predator pressure is to try to protect them. To add the apple cider vinegar, you can either do that if you have a chemilizer. It often has a 1:128 ratio already preset, and that works okay. Otherwise, it can be done as simply as taking a pitcher with the apple cider vinegar or a bottle, and just basically doing a splash of that into each of the drinkers. And having the chemilizer, it does keep it as a kind of a constant, regular amount. So that's a better way to go. But it just depends on what kind of water system you have, and if you have the possibility of doing that as well. How soon do we start it? We can start it as soon as week 2 on a low level. So usually week 2 or 3, we start looking at adding some apple cider vinegar. We don't always do it We don't always do it always as consistently as in the same ways, but the more you do it, it's not harmful. So it's good to get that into their diet. As far as the grit, we don't worry about that a lot because they're out on the paddocks and they find plenty of rocks and things in the paddock to eat as well if they need it. So we haven't focused on that a lot. As far as the herbs, yeah, we've heard of that. I have a few using the St. John's wort to kind of calm them a bit before harvesting. We don't typically do that, but I think it's possible that someone could use that. Again, for the stress, it's really about the stress to be able to keep them calm for that time. So by letting it get dark enough before you move in and start picking them up, or not using a lot of even headlamps with that light, it can get them kind of scared, and they will begin to all run to the corner, and then some of them can get injured. So keeping it dark, doing it late enough, doing it gently enough, slowly enough, it can help to do some of those things as well without the additional herbs. So it looks like those were our chat questions. So if anybody else has any verbally, certainly welcome to speak up.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Pedro.
I got a question about how the pasture develops on time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you see that there's more cover year after year? Like, I'm a little concerned about the pressure of the birds in the paddock. So you see there's a positive like evolution on it, or?
Yes.
Would you recommend some rest, like a year rest, or?
I think what we did is tried to get the pasture established the year before we loaded the chickens on there. So at least by late summer, early fall, to get that started so it has a chance to root well and establish before the chickens are let out in the spring. We do have a problem here in Minnesota with, because of the winters, the early spring, March, April, still there's not much grass that has begun to sprout or come back to life after the winter. So that early chicken pressure can really be hard on the ground. By starting a little bit later, or really getting that well established the year before, you're able to kind of keep ahead of the chickens. That's the important thing, is to keep resprouting it, keep moving them around. It's not that the pasture will stay perfect, because those chickens can be pretty hard on any vegetation that grows. But by at least having an established paddock, you keep some control over the weeds that otherwise will take over your space. But yeah, the chickens, I think just give it some time to get at least established before you bring them out, and then keep moving them. If it's big enough, keep moving them around within that paddock, or as you rotate, try to get right on top of the old one as soon as you can. Try to get something going. But the idea is that they can go ahead and eat those sprouts. They can eat it down, because that's what really will serve them well. But yeah, just to try using the paddock as best you can. The chickens won't leave it all alone, but it won't be perfect. But it at least is doing something to try to keep a better environment for them.
And for that movement, like moving the feeders, it's enough, or you think fencing is better strategy?
We still have the fence on the outside perimeter of about 200 feet by 300 feet. We have that area fenced in, and then we just move the feeders back further in that space, and that works about.